welcome everybody to the National Biography Day, on the day, the 16th of May, when the great biographer James Boswell met for the first time Dr. Johnson. My name is James Knox, and I'm chairman of the Boswell Trust, which has run the Boswell Book Festival for the last 10 years. And I was going to be making this initial talk outside in Auchinleck graveyard, where James Boswell is buried. True to form, Ayrshire weather has behaved superbly this afternoon, and we are just enjoying a wonderful downpour, which I think James Boswell would have thoroughly enjoyed, because one of the many things he often wrote about in his journals when Laird of Auchinleck down the road from this very church was how very heavy the torrential rain was in the Auchinleck district. And probably this is the 18th century microclimate that we are enjoying at this very moment. So I'm not outside in the graveyard, but I will be very shortly after we've heard from our first guest today. But as it happens, I'm standing in the 17th century church of Auchinleck, against which is the mausoleum, which we will also be seeing later, where James Boswell is buried. We will also be going on a tour of this historic and soulful graveyard with one of the great experts on Scottish graveyards, in fact graveyards in Europe too, called Peter Ross, who's written the most wonderful book called Tomb with a View. And I'll be talking to him about his experiences and stories of graveyards, and also about the people buried in this wonderful churchyard. But first of all, I would like to introduce you to our guest, Dr. Gordon Turnbull from Yale University in America. As I say, if it hadn't been for the downpour, I would have been standing alongside my cue, which is a monumental bronze feather writing quill, which the Boswell Trust commissioned in 2016 as a landmark for the restoration of the graveyard, which we have undertaken, and also as a memorial to the power of the written word. And you will see it later, after you've heard from Gordon himself, who will be talking about this very quill, because on the reverse of the quill is inscribed the sentence or two that Boswell wrote on that very day, the 16th of May in 1763, describing his first historic meeting with Dr. Johnson, and what a lightning strike of inspiration that was, as many writers after him have had too, whether they are writing with a quill, a fountain pen, or a keyboard. So this is a celebration of biography today, and a celebration of Boswell's first meeting with the great Dr. Johnson. Now I'm handing you over to Dr. Gordon Turnbull, who will speak so eloquently for the next 30 minutes. You will be carried back into the 18th century and really understand the lifetime's work and genius of James Boswell. I spoke to Dr. Turnbull earlier, and now here he is.
Well, it's a pleasure on Sunday, May the 16th, National Biographers Day, to join you with Peter Ross here in the Auchinleck Churchyard to commemorate not just National Biographers Day, but quite possibly the greatest biographer who ever put quill to paper. The quill that is commemorated here, along with the hand that held it in the Auchinleck Churchyard. I'm Gordon Turnbull, General Editor of the Yale Editions of the private papers of James Boswell. The papers are held here at Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut, in the new and improved England. They are in the Beinecke Library in the maximum security climate-controlled depths of that building in acid-free boxes, where they will do what Boswell wanted the figures he wrote about to do and last forever. The hand that held the quill, here commemorated now in the Auchinleck graveyard, is a hand that changed the course of writing, the hand that basically brought modern biography as we know it into being. And it began with a seemingly innocuous diary entry made on the 16th of May, 1763 by a young Scot on his travels, James Boswell. He first of all went to visit a Scottish acquaintance, James Love, an actor and theatre manager he'd known from Edinburgh. Boswell was quite passionate about the theatre. It had a big impact on him in his late adolescence. And he looked up Mr. Love, who owed him some money. After that, he went by invitation to drink tea at the home of another actor, an Englishman, Thomas Davies, who also owned a bookshop. He was a great friend of Samuel Johnson. Davies had initially invited Boswell to meet Johnson on Christmas Day, but unfortunately Johnson had gone off to Oxford and Boswell missed the moment. Boswell had been reading Johnson's writings with admiration and awe from his youth and longed to meet him. But by this point, May, 5 months after that Christmas missed opportunity, he'd almost given up hope. But suddenly Johnson unexpectedly walked in. Boswell was caught a little bit on the hop, but he went home that night and wrote down a brief and hurried diary entry. I drank tea at Davies's in Russell Street. It's number 8 Russell Street, Covent Garden. It's commemorated with a sign there now. And about 7 came in the great Mr. Samuel Johnson, whom I have so long wished to see. Mr. Davies introduced me to him. As I knew his mortal antipathy at the Scotch, I cried to Davies, don't tell him where I come from. However, he said, from Scotland. Mr. Johnson, said I, indeed I come from Scotland, but I cannot help it. Sir, replied he, that is what I find a great many of your countrymen cannot help. Boswell then goes on with a brief description of Johnson as a very big man with various physical ailments and troubles. 20 or so years later, Boswell came with the hand that holds the quill, commemorated here in the graveyard, to turn that moment, that fleeting moment that his diary entry caught, into a fully blossomed biographical reminiscence. He piles in details in the life entry that he could not have fully appreciated at the time. Most importantly, he quotes Tom Davies as having perceived Johnson through the glass door in the room in which we were sitting, advancing towards us. Davies announced his awful approach to me somewhat in the manner of an actor in the part of Horatio when he addresses Hamlet on the appearance of his father's ghost. Look, my lord, it comes. Boswell goes on to describe various other details. What are we to make of that belated invocation of Hamlet and his ghost? Catching a diary moment is one thing. Unfolding it later into a biographical account is another. Tom Davies was an actor who had played parts in Hamlet on the stage, but when Boswell remembers that detail much later, he is calling to mind the most Hamlet-esque and even Johnsonian of all emotions, guilty procrastination. He knows the task is now upon him, long expected, long self-demanded, to get the biography written. And he is remembering the ghost of Hamlet's father's repeated injunction to remember. He says it to Hamlet in Act 1 over and over again, remember. And that is what Boswell, as biographer, sets out to do. He tells us at the beginning of this diary that he does not want life to evaporate in oblivion. And his wonderful diaries, letters, and other papers did what the ghost of Hamlet's father did too. They were buried and came back from the dead in resurrection to tell us things about the past that we otherwise, like Hamlet, would not have known. There were biographies before Boswell, of course. Most of them were of political, military, religious eminences. We talk about Boswell as having pioneered modern biography. In some ways he did. In specific, he pioneered or did more than anybody else to boost literary biography, writers who take on the lives of other writers. It is in its way a challenging thing. What do writers do? In one sense, nothing. They sit around and write. Why is that interesting? Boswell asked the searching questions. Where does that literary output come from? How did it generate itself? Why didn't the person living next door to Johnson in Lichfield come up with these remarkable moral essays, The Rambler, The Idler, that very wry anti-novel, Rasselas, Prince of Abyssinia, the extraordinary, quirky, but nonetheless monumental English dictionary? How did that happen? What is the wellspring of these words? Where is wisdom to be found? An old biblical question. Boswell was fascinated by these topics and set about to interrogate them. Boswell's diary style has a demotic fluency that's deceptive in its seeming simplicity. Try and do it. It's not as easy as it looks. He takes the experience of the day, the diurnal, which gives us the word journal, and day gives us the word diary, and condenses it into interesting prose paragraphs that somehow catch the rhythms and the depths of experience in a demotic fluency, in readable form. Boswell was both a writer of the 18th century and of the 20th. He published his Life of Johnson, first edition, in 1791, but his papers were not, as we know, recovered until the early 20th century. And his now best-selling London Journal of 1762-3, the one that the hand holding the quill, now commemorated in the Churchyard, wrote, did not appear in print until 1950, and when it did, it became a runaway worldwide bestseller. And it made Boswell one of the great 20th century writers. Yes, there is something about the fluency and demotic nature of Boswell's prose that makes it transcend periods. He had both the Samuel Richardsonian ability to write to the moment, to capture an evanescent, fleeting moment in a diary entry, but also to shape it with the overarching narrative structures of his own favorite novelist, Henry Fielding, who in Tom Jones, from the moment he started at the beginning, knew where he was going to at the end. Boswell deftly cherry-picked the finest literary tendencies of the prose of his period and wrote, as has been said of Shakespeare, not for an age, but for all time. As he traveled through Europe, he felt himself more and more drawn to heroes of the mind, like Rousseau and Voltaire and Beldezoilen, Zélide, as she styled herself, and even the great leader of Corsica, Pascal Paoli, appears more typically in Boswell's account of him as a wise man, as a philosopher, as an Enlightenment leader of a nation, a small nation, pioneering democracy and moving away from autocratic rule. Even Paoli appears more as a hero of the mind, a dispenser of wise sayings, thoughtful utterances that future people can make use of. Johnson was on Boswell's mind as he traveled through Europe. And it was in that period, we don't quite know precisely when the intention to write the biography fully formed, but it certainly blossomed during that European tour, when Boswell met many people, many great figures, and finds himself more and more drawn to heroes of the mind, those who have the power to craft and shape futurity, people who have authored works that will endure beyond their own physical lives. They became the true Boswellian heroes. What the recovery of Boswell's papers has taught us mostly is that with the figure of Johnson as a quotable man and somebody whose works will endure beyond his own physical life, and whose great thematic concern really was all along. I mean, Johnson's output is very complex and disparate, but if he had one recurrent theme, it was the relationship between the ephemeral and the permanent. What is just evanescent and of no importance, which for Johnson was almost all journalism, by the way, and what will endure, what is worth future generations' attention. Boswell's recovered papers show us that in that respect, with Johnson, he merely hit the mother lode. There are many more mini biographies in Boswell's papers than you can count. He wrote down everybody he met, random passengers in coaches, villagers of Auchinleck. There are recorded in his diaries humble people like millers, coal miners, quarrymen, carters, tenant farmers, and their wives, brothers, sisters, children, and so forth. Those records Boswell carefully kept and wanted to leave behind him even when he knew his end was coming. Those documents in which he records the lives of many of the people sleeping quietly around this mausoleum in Auchinleck survive in Boswell's papers when they don't on their own headstones, because time and weather have had their effects. There's a quarryman called Andrew Morton who died a horrible death. A blast in the quarry knocked him over a ledge and he fell 30 feet and was horribly injured and died a lingering death. His son, James Morton, was a mason and made him a beautiful headstone. Time and weather have had their effects on that, but the names live on in Boswell's records of these things. As Shakespeare said, not marble nor the gilded monuments of princes shall outlive my rhyme. In a curious way, paper and ink have proved more durable. Boswell wanted to defeat the forces of oblivion, wanted to stave off mortality in the only way he could think of doing. And biography became his element, his habitus for doing it. Not just in things like the life of Johnson and the earlier trial balloon for it, the tour to the Hebrides, but also in his diaries and letters where he jotted down people who otherwise would have been swept away by the forces of time and oblivion. He turned more often than not to biography for his own reading pleasure. In this, he very much shared the opinion of Johnson. It's often been wondered why these two very dissimilar men were drawn to each other. They were very different, but there were areas of overlap and affinity. Johnson wrote a very famous Rambler essay, number 60, in which he basically extols the benefits and virtues of biography over all other forms of reading. Those parallel circumstances and kindred images to which we readily conform our minds are, above all other writings, to be found in narratives of the lives of particular persons, and therefore no species of writing seems more worthy of cultivation than biography, since none can be more delightful or more useful. None can more certainly enchain the heart by irresistible interest or more widely diffuse instruction to every diversity of condition. Nobody on earth has ever written in quite the way Dr. Johnson has. Now, Boswell, for his part, shared that sentiment and endorsed it, but took it in his own direction. When he came to write his own series of essays as the hypochondriac, in its 18th century sense, meaning a melancholy man, a depressive, which Boswell often was, he wrote several times on the topic of hypochondria or depression itself. And that led him to confess to his readers in the London magazine, where he published his hypochondriac papers, as follows: when in a state of horrible depression, as the globe itself now is in conditions of pandemic, when we have been thrown back upon ourselves and our own internal resources that are getting tested in ways they never have been tested before. In states of depression and solitude like those, Boswell says, I have generally found that the reading of lives do me most good by withdrawing my attention from myself to others and entertaining me in the most satisfactory manner with real incidents in the varied course of human existence. I look upon the Biographica Britannica, that's a collection of biographies of his own name, with that kind of grateful regard with which one who has been recovered from painful indisposition by their medicinal springs beholds Bath, Bristol, or Tunbridge. That is a quite striking sentiment. Boswell quite literally sees the reading of biography as medicinal, or as we would say now, therapeutic. In an 18th century medical sense, purgative. They were always purging themselves. And why? Because it takes you, James Boswell, or anybody, whoever you are, out of the prison house of selfhood and into the lives and minds of others. Boswell's teacher at the University of Glasgow for a period of time was Adam Smith. And before he became famous as the economist of The Wealth of Nations, he produced a very important earlier book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, in which, for Adam Smith, the very glue that holds human civilization and society together is sympathy, sympathos, fellow feeling, a feeling that one has for the other. And in Boswell's account in his hypochondriac essay, this is fully formed. And it is taking yourself out of yourself into the life and mind of another. That is the best form of literary therapeutic rescue. Boswell feared death very much. It led into some extraordinary situations. Two of the best known are his interview recorded in his diaries with the philosopher David Hume, as we know, a religious skeptic. Boswell would use the word infidel about him, meaning atheistic. Boswell went to see him when he knew he was dying and really wanted to probe David Hume about whether he was completely serene about the fact, as Hume understood it, that he was about to enter cessation of being, into oblivion. And Boswell tried to rattle him with his questions, but it went the other way. Hume was perfectly serene, stated that it was of no more concern to him that he would cease to exist than that he once had not existed. And Boswell himself was much shaken by Hume's account. He had great trouble with it. He went away confused, puzzled, and shocked. And he brought this up later with Dr. Johnson, who has classically, typically Johnsonian answers to all questions of this kind. Hume is not afraid of death. Point a pistol at David Hume and see how he will behave, etc. Boswell also sought out the company of the elderly Henry Hume, Lord Kames, one of his father's colleagues on the bench of the Scottish courts, to find out how he was confronting his own end. That was a trickier situation. Some of the more unsavory aspects of Boswell's quest to understand what death was led him into a compulsive and excited attendance at public hangings. He went to executions, as did tens of thousands of others, by the way. This is in no way distinctive or unusual to Boswell, however troubling we may find it. He watched closely. He tried to catch dying words on the scaffold to try to understand what the end of physical existence was. His Christian feelings never deserted him. He led a very wayward life, as we know. One of the keys to Boswell's existence is the boyhood agony he suffered. He writes about this at great length in an Ébauche de ma vie, a sketch of my life that he wrote to introduce himself to Rousseau in the village of Moutier in Switzerland in 1764. The pain that the Knoxian Calvinist Presbyterian version of the Christian religion caused him as a boy a major part of his reason for drifting southwards to London was that he found in the Anglican and Roman Catholic forms of worship, for that matter, a more forgiving version of the divinity than Calvinist Presbyterian offered him. He found in Roman Catholicism and Anglicanism, rightly or wrongly, is not for me to say, a God of forgiveness and mercy, which the God of John Knox's Calvinism for Boswell was not. All his life long, he retained a profoundly Christian sense of reality, that heaven and hell did exist. And in fact, his friend and banker, Sir William Forbes, who came out to Auchinleck in July of 1795 to attend Boswell's internment, wrote a quite moving account of the occasion in a form of 2 diary letters back to his much beloved wife, Elizabeth, Betsy, back in Edinburgh. And so William Forbes made a point of highlighting in his account of the funeral and a retrospective account of Boswell himself for his wife, made a point of emphasizing the Christian belief. So William Forbes writes that he came to Auchinleck House. At 1 o'clock, the company invited to the funeral began to arrive. At 2, we sat down to dinner, 44 gentlemen. And in an hour and a half, we set out for the church of Auchinleck at about a couple of miles distance. They traveled over the Barony Road, the Via Sacra, that Lord Auchinleck was very proud of having built, connecting Auchinleck House to the church. Besides the hearse and a mourning coach, there were 12 gentlemen's carriages, the rest of the company on horseback. About a couple of dozen of the principal tenants likewise on horseback in mourning, many of them with new suits for the occasion. A large body of Mr. Boswell's tenants on foot. The vault is hewn out of the rock, very curious. And there I assisted in depositing the remains of a friend who during 36 years had never met me but with a smile of gladness to see me, and whose steady attachment I shall ever remember with gratitude. In a letter which I received on Saturday morning, just as I was setting out from our worthy friend, Mr. Langton, that's Bennet Langton, who was a great friend of Dr. Johnson and Boswell both. After lamenting the premature fate of our common friend, Mr. Boswell, he not unaptly applies to him, and here we come back to Hamlet all over again, that part of Hamlet's character of Yorick, a man of excellent fancy. Where be now thy jibes and thy gambols and thy songs, those flashes of merriment that used to set the table in a roar? The quotation is slightly mangled, but we'll overlook that. Either Bennet Langton or Forbes, or both of them, are working from memory, but both of them are sharing a sense of Boswell the man. He was both a melancholy man like Hamlet, and reflective and procrastinating, but also a bit of a jester like Yorick, who on more than one occasion set tables in a roar. Forbes continues, poor fellow, he had wit and humor and genius and fancy in a high degree, but what is infinitely better, he had a warmth of heart and a strong impression of religion on his mind, as well as a fervor of devotion in the practice of it, notwithstanding all his eccentricities, which I have never seen exceeded in any man. Many a joyous and many a solemn discussion I have had with him, so that I cannot feel but a wondrous blank from his loss. I set out from Auchinleck House after breakfast. Nothing could be better or more proper than the deportment of both the young Mr. Boswells, that's Alexander, Boswell's son and heir, and James, his younger brother, who went on to become a quite wonderful Shakespearean scholar. The deportment of both the young Mr. Boswells on this affecting and solemn occasion, I thought I never should have got them out of the vault when the body was deposited in one of the niches. But no matter what Boswell did or where he went or what fluctuations in his thoughts occurred, Auchinleck was an anchor. He was intensely proud of the estate and its long distinguished ancestry. And despite his fluctuating feelings about his Scottish origins, about his passionate longing for London, Auchinleck anchored him. No matter what else he became or did not achieve in life, he was the laird of Auchinleck, and he was fond of his tenants. They were fond of him. Even when he lived in London, he required written reports in very great detail from his overseers, first of all, James Bruce, and second of all, Andrew Gibb. Andrew Gibb and many members of his family are to be seen sleeping quietly here in this churchyard. Auchinleck remained his anchor, and he was never anything but deeply proud of it.
Well, Gordon, that was incredible. Thank you so much for such a wonderful tour d'horizon of everything to do with James Boswell. You really brought him alive, and it's never more poignant if you succeed in doing that. And we are here today standing next door to his burial place in Auchinleck Churchyard. But of course, bringing people alive is really the definition of great biography. Now, we're still actually sheltering in the 17th century kirk in Auchinleck graveyard because the Boswellian downpour is lightning, and so shortly we will be able to go out into the churchyard itself for a really good exploration. But whilst the rain pauses and grows more gentle, it gives me very, very great pleasure to introduce Peter Ross, who has written this absolutely wonderful book called A Tomb with a View, The Glories and Stories of Graveyards, which Hilary Mantel described as a truly moving book, and it is. And it's also funny, and it's atmospheric, and you all need to buy it. And one's first question one always wants to put to Peter, who has won the Scottish Journalist Award 9 times, is what got him interested in graveyards. And so what Peter is going to do now is read to you a short extract from the opening of his book, which explains how he got to be in a situation of writing A Tomb with a View. Peter, thank you for coming here today, and it's a great pleasure to have you, and read away.
Thanks very much, James. I grew up in graveyards. The dead were my babysitters, my quiet companions. Not silent though, they announced themselves with great formality. You only had to read the stones. Here lays the corpse of Mary Dickey, who died December the 18th, 1740, aged 3 years and 9 months. Suffer the little children to come unto me. That's one I remember from the Old Town Cemetery in Stirling. I would spend whole summers there, a littleish child myself, trying to catch tadpoles, those living commas, in the small pond called the Pithy Mary, or taking a poke of penny sweets up onto the Ladies' Rock, a steep outcrop in the centre of the cemetery, where one could enjoy flying saucers and foam shrimps while looking out over the panorama of graves. Those graves, laid out in rows, they were shelves full of stories. I was a shy boy, wary, watchful, living inside myself, living in books. Treasure Island, The Hound of the Baskervilles, adventures from an earlier age. Headstones in that company were just more tales. I would wander among the headstones, reading the inscriptions, gawping at the 18th century carvings, poking a soft finger into the socket of a stone skull, or into the pits left by musket balls in the walls of the medieval church. If the imagination is a muscle, graveyards are a gym. And I would look at the names and I would wonder, did John Barnes, hairdresser, who died aged 67 in January 1891, ever in his youth take comb and scissors to Ebenezer Gentleman, who died at Christmas 1868, and whose crooked stone lies just a step or two away. It never felt frightening, you know, to be surrounded by dead people. In those days, the late 70s, early 80s, the living seemed much more of a threat. The cemetery was in poor repair, lots of vandalism. Worst of all was the monument to a pair of women, Margaret McLaughlin and Margaret Wilson, put to death in Wigton in 1685 for refusing to give up their Protestant religion. They had been tied to stakes and drowned in the rising tide of the Solway Firth. And now here in Stirling, they suffered a second martyrdom, the glass of their memorial smashed, the heads and hands of the marble statues broken off and stolen. Who would do that? The sad truth is that it could have been anyone. The cemetery was haunted by ne'er-do-wells, junkies, punk dafties, solvent huffers with fairy rings of plooks around chafed lips. I lived in mortal fear of a lad known as Tommy Glowbag, who was rumoured to have inhaled so much solvent that a pouch of the stuff had mushroomed, tight and milky, pushing its way through his short ginger hair. Nobody wanted to get close enough to verify this. Tommy had a reputation for recreational violence, and one day, while I was playing alone on the Ladies' Rock, he saw me and began climb. But his legs were rubbery beneath him, and about halfway up, he became, rather appropriately for a glue sniffer, stuck. Still, it was a bad moment. I felt like Jim Hawkins in the rigging, looking down in terror as Israel hands climbed, dagger in teeth, towards him. That was the thing about graveyards, though. They felt like, and they still feel like, treasure houses of stories. Some of these stories are international bestsellers. George Eliot and George Michael in Highgate, Oscar Wilde and Jim Morrison in Père Lachaise. Others, though, are known only locally, if at all. My book, A Tomb with a View, like the best sort of funeral, is a celebration, not a lament. It uncovers the stories and the glories of the best graveyards, from grand city cemeteries to elegiac churchyards like the one just outside here. I love all these places. I love the bones of them, and I want to make you love them too.
Well, here we are again outside, I'm very thrilled to say, now that the downpour is nearly over. And I know you will all have been intrigued to discover what the monumental bronze feather writing quill looks like. And here it is, like a great unveiling. It's over 4 meters tall, and it's leaning against a Scottish pink sandstone inkwell, which, thanks to the downpour, has a black slate top, which, thanks to the downpour, has turned inky black. So it is as though you are about to dip the giant quill into the ink to write the first line of your journal. And speaking of creative writing, this wonderful sculpture is the inspiration for all writers. And at the Boswell Book Festival on the Monday, the 14th of June, we are having a day of masterclasses. So it is open, they are conversational masterclasses with Professor Jane Ridley, who's the Professor of Biography at Buckingham University, the great Times journalist Melanie Reid, and the uber-trendy Ned Sedgwick, who is a cutting-edge app editor and curator. So all of you who want to write, and we all have stories, we all have life stories we know about, we've experienced ourselves, and who want to write a diary, want to write a biography, want to write a memoir, please join those masterclasses, which really will be very, very constructive and inspirational. And that is what the Boswell Trust has wanted to do with this graveyard. For the last 5 years, the Trust has not only been running the book festival, but it's also been restoring and enhancing this beautiful and soulful and historic place. And if I could just go for a walk with Peter now, to give you a good vista of one great view of the very historic churchyard, which has two graves going back to the 17th century, looking down this restored alleyway here, where we have planted 12 yew trees for the 12 apostles. And then if you walk down, you will see an amazing ancient sycamore tree, which almost certainly would have been planted by one of James Boswell's descendants. There's equally an ancient sycamore tree at Dumfries House in the walled-in garden, where, as I said earlier, we would normally be staging our book festival this year. Now we're going to go for an amble back this way, so that I can describe to you the architecture that survives on this historic site, which was originally a Celtic place of worship. On the right, you've got the Victorian church, or the remnants of it, which was built in 1839, largely paid for by the Boswell family, and then suffered a fire in 1939 and was rebuilt. On your left, you see this incredible survival, which is a 17th century church that the Victorian church replaced. And the belfry has, the bell is now in Auchinleck House, 2 miles away, which is owned by the Landmark Trust. And it's dated 1674. And this is an absolutely wonderful crow-stepped Scottish church. It was de-roofed in 1839 when the new church was built. They were ruthless. They didn't want out with the old, in with the new. And it was re-roofed miraculously in the 1970s, which has preserved it. We're now going to stroll up, and you will see how another point of the Great Quill was to act as a counterpoint to the very elegant war memorial, which was created, and yes, and on the back you will see of the quill the inscribed sentences from Boswell's journal, which records his first meeting in Mr. Love's bookshop, in Mr. Davis's bookshop, sorry, and the inky well. So we're walking past now this really handsome 1920s war memorial, which has got wonderful bronze panelled inscriptions commemorating the dead. And the typeface is very typical of the period. It's Glasgow style. It's very much Glasgow style as designed by Charles Rennie Mackintosh and the Glasgow girls of the period, and which went on after World War I. And we're going now to another memorial which commemorates other very significant people from the Auchinleck community. And it's a memorial to the Worthies, and on one face of it lists the Covenanting martyrs. And Peter, perhaps you'd like to talk a bit about the Covenanters and other and the martyrdom that happened and why they were persecuted and how they've been remembered elsewhere.
Well, certainly, as I said in my reading there, my first knowledge of the Covenanters really came from the Martyrs Memorial in the Old Town Churchyard in Stirling, which I happened upon as a child. It's been restored now, but when I first saw it as a kid, it was in a terrible state, and these poor women that had been martyred, who'd been drowned in the Solway Firth, their hands had been chopped off, their heads had been chopped off, the marble I should say. And it just struck me as being particularly horrific. And then later in life I was lucky enough to actually visit their grave, which is in Wigton. I think I thought as a child that the memorial itself was the grave, but the grave of these women is in Wigton. But I just think, places like this, old cemeteries, memorials like this, it really shows that they are really libraries of the dead, aren't they? Whatever your particular interest, whether it's the religious persecutions or Victorian music hall stars, you'll find something in a churchyard or in a cemetery to kind of capture your interest. That's why I love these places.
And the great Pedon, the great preacher and sermonizer of the Covenanters, who was chased all his life and career by the king's troops, he actually died a natural death and was buried in this very graveyard. And when the troops heard about this, they came and dug up his body and wanted to hang it from the gibbet in Cumnock Town Square. And they were only stopped from doing so by the intervention of Lady Dumfries, the chatelaine of Dumfries House, and Lady Boswell of Auchinleck House. And these two doughty, powerful, humane women stopped his remains being strung up, and he was buried at the foot of the gibbet, and there is another memorial to him in Cumnock. That we also celebrate in this monument a great inventor of the Scottish Enlightenment, William Murdoch, who was born in Lugar, just 2 miles away from here. And he was the inventor of gas. And he made his experiments in a cave in the Lugar Valley. And it's interesting to think that William Murdoch then was a very ambitious young man, and he was a very good carpenter. He turned an immaculate copy out of wood of a top hat, which he wore, and he walked wearing this wooden top hat down to Birmingham, where he introduced himself to James Watt. And with Watt, he went on to have some of the greatest inventions of the early Industrial Revolution. And it's fascinating to think that there were 3 geniuses within a few miles of this parish in the 18th century, 3 outstanding geniuses of the Enlightenment: James Boswell, Robert Burns, who was farming just down the road, and William Murdoch. So this was a kernel of creativity and invention in the 18th century. Yeah. So how does this graveyard, this churchyard, match up to others you've seen, Peter?
Well, it's very pretty, I think. Because of the quarrying around here, you have all these gravestones made of red sandstone, which gives it a lovely attractive quality. And obviously it's an old graveyard, a lot of the stones are crooked, some are broken, but I always think that that actually adds to the charm of these places. You know, the British people have for an awful long time enjoyed ruins. You know, Wordsworth wrote Tintern Abbey about this idea, and I think even now in our age of social media you still see that emerging. You know, places like this, one of the reasons that graveyards and cemeteries have become so much more popular for people to come and explore recently is because people can come, they can take a picture of the gravestones on their phone, post it on Instagram. You know, an angel with a wing broken off is much more aesthetically interesting than a pristine angel, or a cross with ivy growing up it is much more kind of exciting to look at than a pristine cross. But more than that, the phones also allow you to begin to learn the stories of some of the people whose names you see on the stones. You know, a name or a particular carving catches your eye, and you can whip out your phone and begin to learn something about that person's life. It's really tremendously good fun and an extraordinary thing to be able to do.
Well, this is very much what the Boswell Trust have done with the restoration of this churchyard, because we have children's trails, graveyard tomb trails, and adults as well. Yeah. And it's very exciting. And actually, if you go on the Boswell website, jamesboswell.scot, I think, someone might correct me, but that is our cool new website. And you go on to the graveyard experience, and actually you can go on to individual graves, and because we've got the whole graveyard mapped, so you can explore it individually. And one of the tombs here is very interesting, is mentioned by James Boswell and written about. And this was the Gibbs family, who were the overseers of the estate. And as Gordon mentioned in his talk, he wrote very fondly of the Gibbses. And also Boswell really recorded so many mini biographies in his journals and letters of people who would be forgotten.
He was very interested in people, wasn't he? You can sense that curiosity when you read the writing, and that's what makes him a great biographer, because he's not afraid to be gossipy, is he? You know, his kind of writing was very different from the kind of type of biography that had come before him.
Yes, he was very uninhibited, and also he was very. He knew how to use charm. Yeah. So he knew how to make people trust him, and also, but charm comes from a genuine empathy and a genuine interest in people. As you say, charm is an underrated gift.
Yeah.
Because actually it is all about empathy and, of course, his brilliance as a writer.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just going to say that I think one of the things about graveyards is that often they've got a very, very famous person buried in them who's the kind of centre of gravity of a graveyard. In this case, of course, it's James Boswell himself. But, surrounding him are many other stories, aren't they? People that he actually knew and who he wrote about.
Yes, so here we have two. This charming this is a 1740s grave slab, which was to one of the Boswell family's gardeners. And you can just make out two tulips on either side and two classical columns. He would have been a gardener to Lord Auchinleck, James Boswell's father.
That's beautiful, isn't it, the tulips there? I love the way you sort of you begin to see something of the person's life, something of their kind of passions in the stone that they leave behind. You've got the kind of columns and the angel or cherub. Those are kind of standard things, but the tulips add that personal touch, don't they?
And we finally have this wonderful 1742 slab, which is to the millers, called Mr. Sampson, who was the miller in Auchinleck, and again was well known to Boswell. And the description which Gordon gave of Boswell's funeral is a testament to how respected and popular Boswell was in Auchinleck and in the community. And it's fitting, therefore, to end this celebration of National Biography Day to stand by the handsome mausoleum, a private family mausoleum in which James Boswell and his family are buried. And you see on this wall here beautiful carving of the Boswell coat of arms. This wonderful structure began life as what in Scotland is called a laird's loft, a landowner's adjunct to a church, which allowed you to sit apart from the congregation. And in this case, inside you would have had a stairway which went up to a gallery, so you overlooked the inside of the 17th century church where we were sheltering during the downpour. When the Victorian church was built, the Laird's Loft was no longer feasible because they removed the roof from the 17th century church. And because the Laird's Loft had been built above the family crypt, the family decided to turn it into a more formal looking mausoleum structure. So they blocked in the windows, they put a lovely urn on the new pyramid roof, and here it sits, standing above Boswell and his family. And it's a very moving thought that Boswell, his father is buried here, his mother is buried here, his stepmother, who he never got on with, is buried here. His beloved wife is buried here, who he was unfaithful to, much to his own mortification and guilt. And his children are buried here, including his son, Alexander, who was the last Scot to be killed in a duel in Scotland. So the Boswells didn't stop being interesting after James died. So to conclude our celebration, I'd like to thank Peter very much for joining us and with your incredibly interesting insights.
It's been a pleasure and a real privilege, and also just incredible to be able to stand so close to Boswell himself, that kind of false intimacy of the grave, just incredible to be here.
Well, thank you, and thank you all for tuning in during our downpour moment. We've been longing for live events, and the first one we've been able to have had to be rearranged because of the downpour, but that's wonderful, wonderful Ayrshire for you. And I would just like to remind you, you have got to tune in to our free virtual Technicolor Book Festival from the 10th to the 14th of June. And it starts with Andrew Marr. It starts with an amazing lineup. Andrew Marr, Robert Burns, Ludwig Beethoven. What more could you want on the first night? And then we go on to have wonderful authors from Lady Glenconnor, Rory Stewart, the travel writer and adventurer, and many, many more. We've even got 2 Labradors starring at the end with Andrew Cotter, the famous sports journalist, and Helen Lewis and Chris Bryant on angry women and glamorous, gay, anti-appeasement politicians before the Second World War. So all human life is going to be at this festival, and don't miss it. Thank you so, so much for joining us today. Well done, Boswell Book Festival National Biography Day. Goodbye.